The late summer sun cast long shadows across the vast desert expanse of southern Arizona. The road stretched endlessly between Tucson and Casa Grande, flanked by dry scrub, rust-colored earth, and the occasional saguaro cactus, standing like sentinels in the heat haze. The sky had begun its slow descent into golden amber as Samuel Harper guided his dark green SUV along the highway. The hum of the tires on asphalt was the only sound in the car, save for the low whisper of the air conditioning. Samuel, a 60-year-old man with a firm build and silver hair cropped neatly at the sides, looked straight ahead, calm and focused. He had spent the day at a government conference in Phoenix, where he had delivered a presentation on structural reforms in the justice system. In the back seat rested a leather portfolio filled with briefing papers and legal documents, evidence of his new role as interim director of the Pinal County Department of Justice. It had been a controversial appointment, prompted by the public scandal and resignation of his predecessor. Samuel had accepted the position with quiet resolve, determined to steer the office through its period of uncertainty and scrutiny. He knew the road well, having driven it countless times over the years. That evening, he was just a man returning home from work. As he passed mile marker 8, the soft glow of red and blue lights flared suddenly in his rearview mirror. The patrol vehicle approached fast, then pulled directly behind him, lights flashing rhythmically. Without hesitation, Samuel slowed down, signaled, and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. He turned off the engine and placed both hands on the steering wheel. Fingers spread, as he had done instinctively throughout his life in public service. The patrol car remained behind him for a moment, engine idling. Dust from the roadside hovered in the fading light. A young officer exited the cruiser and approached slowly. His expression was tight, his posture rigid, and the way he walked spoke more of suspicion than duty. He arrived at the driver's window and began asking questions in a clipped, impatient tone. His hand rested near his holstered weapon. Samuel answered calmly, reaching for his identification only when instructed. The officer barely glanced at the documents before calling something over his shoulder. A second officer joined them within moments. Taller, broader, and visibly more aggressive, this one stood with arms crossed, his presence immediately more confrontational. He stepped closer to the door, eyeing Samuel with thinly veiled distrust. The younger officer mentioned something vague about traffic violations and inconsistencies. The conversation turned from procedural to accusatory. There were no signs of reasonable suspicion, but they began pressing harder, asking why Samuel was driving alone, where he had been, why his route was what it was. Despite Samuel's composed demeanor and transparent answers, the tone escalated. The larger officer ordered him to exit the vehicle. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before complying, stepping out with the deliberate, measured movements of someone who knew too well the risks of misunderstanding. He stood on the gravel shoulder, hands visible, the dry wind tugging slightly at his jacket. Without explanation, the officers began to search his vehicle. The doors were flung open. The back seat was rifled through. One officer unzipped his portfolio, spilling neatly arranged documents onto the floor. Folders were opened, papers skimmed and discarded with casual disregard. The younger officer searched the trunk while the older one peered under the seats. Their conversation was curt, coded in brief exchanges over the radio. At no point was a reason given, no warrant cited, no probable cause stated. They found nothing. No contraband, no suspicious materials, only papers, a laptop, and a half-empty bottle of water. But that didn't stop them. They claimed Samuel had failed to follow verbal commands, commands he had clearly obeyed. They cited vague concerns about his behavior and tone. Then, without further warning, they placed him in handcuffs, the metal pressed cold against his wrists. He didn't resist. Dust swirled around his feet as they led him toward the patrol car. The sun was nearly gone now, dipping behind the low horizon and leaving behind only streaks of orange and purple. The desert grew quiet again, save for the crackle of the police radio and the slam of a door closing behind him. Inside the back of the cruiser, Samuel sat still, breathing evenly, his gaze steady. His heart beat faster than usual, but not out of fear. It beat with something else. Disbelief mixed with the heavy knowledge that he, of all people, had just become another example of the system he had been working to fix. The night had passed slowly within the cinder-block walls of the Pinal County Jail. Samuel Harper sat on a hard metal bench in a holding cell illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The air inside was cold and sterile, carrying the scent of disinfectant and damp concrete. He had not been given much to eat, and sleep had come in short, fragmented intervals interrupted by echoing footsteps, metallic clanks of opening doors, and distant arguments in other cells. Still, Samuel sat upright, calm but alert, his posture betraying none of the humiliation he had endured. His mind stayed focused, refusing to drift into bitterness. He knew the institution from within, had walked its corridors in an official capacity more times than he could count. Now, as an inmate, he observed the same routines from the other side of the bars. He recognized faces, uniforms, and the indifferent expressions of officers moving through their shifts. Some glanced at him with curiosity. A few seemed to realize who he was, but said nothing. He kept his composure, even as irony weighed heavily on him. This was the very system he had promised to fix. Bloated with power, starved of accountability, and now it held him like any other anonymous detainee. Samuel knew he wouldn't be here long. He had quietly planned for this possibility, not this exact incident, but the general risk of retribution or abuse of power. His SUV had been retrofitted with a concealed dash cam capable of uploading footage to cloud storage in real time. He had also been instrumental in passing new state legislation requiring all law enforcement officers to wear active body cameras during interactions with civilians. He had helped draft the language of the bill, negotiated its implementation timeline, and insisted on severe consequences for tampering or noncompliance. Somewhere out there, the footage existed, raw, time-stamped, and undeniable. It showed him complying at every step, speaking with calm clarity, and submitting to orders that had no legal basis. It showed the officer's aggression, the unjustified search, and the moment they handcuffed him, despite the absence of any threat or resistance. That footage was his strongest ally now, and he trusted that the right people would see it. By morning, a trusted colleague, a retired prosecutor who had long respected Samuel's work, arranged for a defense attorney to visit the station. The lawyer arrived prepared, carrying a laptop and a signed affidavit from Samuel's legal contact. They had already retrieved the dash cam footage from cloud storage, and the video had been reviewed, edited for clarity, and saved to a secure drive. When the attorney demanded a meeting with the watch commander, he was met with resistance at first, but the mention of Samuel's full name caused a visible shift in demeanor. Inside a small office away from the holding cells, the footage played on a screen as the attorney remained silent, letting the images speak for themselves. The video showed Samuel's SUV pulling to the side of the road, his hands on the steering wheel, his slow, deliberate exit from the car. It captured the officer's curt tones, their increasingly hostile demeanor, the unauthorized search, and the unnecessary arrest. Not a single frame showed aggression or defiance from Samuel. There was only clarity, calm, and procedural overreach by the arresting officers. Word spread quickly within the department. The sheriff himself, a seasoned lawman with years of service behind him, was called into the station to view the footage. He watched with arms folded, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. He had known of Samuel Harper for decades, not as a friend, but as a principled public servant. He had read the headlines when Samuel was appointed interim director and had even congratulated him through official channels. He had not expected his own deputies to be the source of such a gross, professional embarrassment. Back in the cell, Samuel remained unaware of the exact sequence of events unfolding upstairs, but he could feel the atmosphere begin to shift. An officer arrived with a clipboard and avoided eye contact. Paperwork was signed in hushed tones. Another officer, one Samuel recognized from his days at the county courthouse, stepped in and nodded respectfully. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was clear. He was released within the hour, his belongings returned in a plastic bag, including his phone, wallet, and car keys. His jacket was still dusty from the roadside. Outside, the sun was once again high in the Arizona sky, bright and hot against the pavement. He paused briefly at the exit, taking in a breath of dry desert air. His dignity was intact, but what had happened could not be undone. The system had shown its face to him in a way it rarely did to people of his position. And now, with the footage in the hands of his lawyer, The process of reckoning would begin, not just for the officers involved, but for the culture that allowed it. Exactly 7 days after the arrest, Samuel Harper returned to the Pinal County Courthouse, this time no longer as a reformer or detainee, but as a citizen seeking justice. The courthouse was familiar territory, its marble floors, oak-paneled walls, and the solemn presence of law hung thick in the air. He had testified here in numerous hearings over the years, but this time, the roles were inverted. Now he was the accused. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension that often precedes cases involving authority figures and alleged misconduct. A few reporters sat in the back, scribbling notes. Several civil rights advocates had come after learning who was involved. The judge presiding over the hearing was known for his no-nonsense demeanor, a reputation built over 2 decades on the bench. His reputation was not for leniency, but for balance. He entered the courtroom without ceremony, adjusted his glasses, and immediately set the tone for the proceeding, concise, controlled, and grounded in the facts. Samuel sat beside his attorney, his posture straight, hands folded. He appeared neither bitter nor combative. His demeanor was the same as it had been during the arrest, calm, measured, focused. The prosecutor began the session by outlining the charges originally filed: obstruction, failure to comply, and suspicion of transport of controlled substances. They were standard in cases like this, often used to justify roadside detentions. But even as the prosecutor read them aloud, his voice lacked conviction. There was a subtle hesitance, as if he were aware the charges wouldn't hold. Samuel's attorney stood in motion to submit the footage from the dash cam into evidence. The judge approved it without resistance. The courtroom lights dimmed and the screen at the front flickered to life. The video played in silence, time-stamped and uninterrupted. It showed Samuel pulling over, placing his hands visibly on the wheel, complying with each command, and being treated with growing hostility. The search that followed was careless and aggressive. Nothing illegal was found. The arrest appeared unjustified, and Samuel never once raised his voice or refused to cooperate. When the dashcam video concluded, the attorney requested body camera footage from both officers. The prosecution confirmed they had received only one recording. The second officer, the one who had initiated the stop, had failed to activate his camera. It was a direct violation of department policy and state law. The courtroom stirred slightly at this revelation. The judge took a moment to note the infraction, his expression darkening. The single body cam video they had was played next. It corroborated the dashcam footage entirely. It captured the tone of the officers, the disproportionate nature of their actions, and the absence of any legal justification. It painted a picture not of a suspect resisting arrest, but of a man being stripped of dignity by those meant to uphold the law. Once the videos ended, the attorney rested the case, stating that no further evidence was required. The prosecutor, now clearly uncomfortable, rose and addressed the court. He admitted that based on the evidence presented, there was no criminal conduct on Mr. Harper's part. He stated that the charges should be dismissed in full. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand to silence the reaction. He turned his attention to the written report submitted by the arresting officers, which had described a non-compliant driver in a tense situation that necessitated escalation. The judge, having seen the footage, found no truth in those accounts. He stated firmly that the arrest had no basis, that Mr. Harper had conducted himself with restraint, and that the officers involved had acted in clear violation of procedure. He ordered the immediate dismissal of all charges and issued a mandate for the department to launch an internal investigation into the conduct of both officers, with a specific emphasis on the failure to record the stop and the discrepancies between written reports and video evidence. He noted that such actions undermined public trust and warranted administrative scrutiny. Samuel remained composed as the gavel struck. He stood, nodded to the judge, and quietly exited the courtroom, followed by his attorney. Outside, the press waited, but he offered no statements. There would be time for that later. For now, the system had done what it was supposed to, however late. But in Samuel's eyes, the trial had not been a victory. It was a reminder of how easily power can be misused and how fragile the protections are for even the most law-abiding citizens. The story began to circulate rapidly, first among local news outlets, then on regional networks. and eventually onto national platforms. What started as a standard roadside incident had transformed into a broader conversation about authority, justice, and the silent weight of assumption. Samuel Harper's name reappeared not in the context of his work as a legal reformer, but as a man momentarily stripped of that identity by a pair of uniforms and flashing lights. News anchors introduced the footage with caution and commentary. Segments replayed the moments of the stop, the calm behavior of Harper, and the stark contrast of the officer's aggression. Legal analysts debated the procedural violations. Civil rights advocates framed it as yet another example in a pattern of systemic behavior. Some of the commentary focused on Harper's status, his credentials, his age, his experience. Others, however, pointed to something deeper, more uncomfortable. They asked why such behavior would have gone unquestioned if the man had not been who he was. Online forums ignited with arguments. Some users claimed the officers had simply made an honest mistake and didn't know who they were dealing with. They expressed sympathy, even for the officers, saying the modern climate put them under immense pressure. Others fired back with sharper criticism, arguing that the issue wasn't whether they knew Harper's identity, but that such behavior would likely have occurred no matter who had been behind the wheel. The idea that justice was tied to recognition, status, or power disturbed many. It sparked uncomfortable questions. How many others had gone through similar treatment without cameras or legal teams to protect them? Meanwhile, within law enforcement circles, the incident created internal friction. Some officers defended their colleagues, insisting that fieldwork was unpredictable and fast-moving, often requiring tough decisions in ambiguous situations. Others privately expressed embarrassment, disappointed that fellow officers had disregarded protocol and painted the entire department in a negative light. For precinct leadership, the case had turned into a public relations problem and a policy headache. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Statements were drafted carefully. The sheriff, once a quiet supporter of Harper's reform efforts, now had to address both public scrutiny and internal unrest. In the community, the response was just as divided. Some of Harper's old neighbors and colleagues reached out in support, offering encouragement and frustration in equal measure. A few civic leaders invited him to speak at forums and town halls, hoping he would use the incident to highlight broader systemic issues. He agreed to a few, but declined most. Harper knew the dangers of becoming a symbol. He had never wanted that role. His life had been built on structure, on quiet influence, on policies that spoke louder than speeches. Still, not everyone welcomed the attention. Some emails and letters arrived with thinly veiled resentment, accusations that he was making too much of the situation, that he was using his position to shame the department. A few went further, suggesting he had orchestrated the incident to stir division. These messages, though fewer in number, revealed a deep resistance to change. Harper read each one with the same quiet patience he'd carried through the courtroom. He responded to none. At the center of all this remained the footage, the undeniable clinical documentation of what had occurred. It hung over the town like a mirror, reflecting more than just a traffic stop. It exposed a fracture between expectation and reality, between what people thought the system was and what it occasionally became in the absence of accountability. Samuel Harper didn't make public statements. He didn't attend the rallies or media panels. Instead, he returned to his work. But something had changed, not in his methods or beliefs, but in his understanding of their reach. He now carried a different weight when speaking of reform, not theoretical or strategic, but personal, embodied. The incident had moved from principle to lived experience, and for many who watched the story unfold, the takeaway wasn't just about Harper. It was about everyone who didn't have his visibility, his connections, or his calm resolve. The questions raised would linger far beyond the news cycle, and the answers, if they came, would need more than footage. They would require a reckoning with power, perception, and the uncomfortable truth that justice was not always as blind as people like to believe. The two officers involved in the incident faced immediate administrative action. The department, under growing pressure from both the public and oversight committees, announced their temporary suspension pending a full internal review. The younger officer, whose aggression had escalated the encounter, chose to resign before the investigation concluded. His resignation came with a brief, impersonal statement released through a legal representative. The older officer, perhaps more shaken by the public scrutiny or more aware of the ethical implications, issued a formal apology during a departmental meeting that was later leaked to the press. His words were measured, his voice reportedly unsteady. The apology did not erase what had happened, but it became a small footnote in a rapidly evolving story. Samuel Harper, however, remained far from finished. Though he had not initially intended to become the face of reform, the incident had thrust him into a position where silence would have felt like complicity. At the next county assembly, he stood before the board and spoke not only of what had been done to him, but of what it represented. His tone was firm, his arguments precise. He spoke without anger, relying instead on clarity, facts, and lived experience. He laid out a series of policy proposals aimed at restoring trust and ensuring accountability. The reform package he proposed included mandatory publication of body camera footage within 72 hours of any use of force incident, a clear and public disciplinary framework for officer misconduct, and the creation of an independent civilian review board with the authority to investigate complaints. He emphasized that these measures were not about punishment, but about transparency and prevention. He referenced other jurisdictions that had adopted similar practices with success. He spoke of community trust not as an abstract value, but as a measurable necessity for effective policing. Not everyone in the room agreed. Several council members pushed back. One questioned the cost of implementing the review board. Another expressed concern about the morale of law enforcement officers. A third warned of politicizing police work. But their objections were met with growing resistance, not from Harper, but from the community itself. Residents began to attend meetings in larger numbers than usual. They came with stories of their own: unjust stops, silent mistreatment, unreported intimidation. Many of them had never spoken publicly before. Now, galvanized by Harper's ordeal, they saw an opening. Local newspapers began running editorials. Civil society groups organized listening sessions and workshops. What had started as a single incident was now a movement fueled by collective memory and a hunger for reform. Harper's proposals, once seen as idealistic, gained traction through repetition and support. The tide shifted slowly but undeniably. Council members who had once remained non-committal began to reconsider their positions in the face of public attention and electoral concerns. By the end of the month, the county assembly held a formal vote on the reform package. The session was tense, the debate long, but when the results were announced, the majority had sided with change. Most of Harper's proposals passed, some with amendments, others intact. The body camera mandate, in particular, received unanimous support, a symbolic gesture of consensus, perhaps, or a calculated move in response to public pressure. The aftermath extended beyond policy. Training programs were reevaluated. Supervisors began holding more frequent review sessions. A new liaison position was created to handle community complaints and ensure timely follow-up. The atmosphere within the department shifted from defensiveness to cautious reflection. Some officers resisted the changes, claiming they undermined authority. Others, especially newer recruits, welcomed the clearer guidelines and structure. For Harper, the success was tempered by the reality that no reform was permanent without vigilance. He remained engaged, not as a crusader, but as a steady presence in policy discussions and oversight meetings. He declined media appearances, preferring to work behind the scenes. His influence, once formal through title, now spread through respect earned by endurance and reason. The consequences of that summer evening on the highway had stretched far beyond its immediate discomfort. They had exposed flaws, triggered responses, and forced a community to confront its blind spots. The work was far from finished, but it had begun in earnest. And for those who had watched from the sidelines, the message was clear. Accountability was no longer optional, and silence was no longer safe. 2 months had passed since the incident. The summer heat had begun to wane, and the desert air carried the scent of dust and creosote as the sun dipped low over the Arizona horizon. Samuel Harper once again drove the familiar stretch of highway between Tucson and Casa Grande. This time not for work, not for hearings or press conferences, but simply to be alone with his thoughts. The road had become something of a symbol, first of humiliation, then of resolve, and now, perhaps, of reconciliation. The landscape looked unchanged at first glance, but there were subtle differences. Small surveillance cameras had been installed at key intersections, angled toward areas where prior complaints had emerged. Road signs carried notices reminding drivers of their rights during traffic stops. Patrol vehicles bore updated decals indicating participation in new training protocols. These weren't sweeping changes that a stranger might notice, but to Samuel, every new addition was a quiet mark of progress. His vehicle moved at a steady pace, windows cracked open to let in the breeze. The same stretch of pavement where blue lights had once erupted in his rearview mirror now felt strangely peaceful. The fear that had once taken root there had been replaced by something firmer. A sense of purpose earned the hard way. He had not returned to this road out of nostalgia or pride. He returned because he needed to see the aftermath for himself, away from reports and statistics, unfiltered by headlines. He passed the mile marker where the stop had taken place. For a moment he considered pulling over, but instead he kept driving, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He remembered the weight of silence in the back seat of the patrol car, the sterile chill of the holding cell, and the disbelief that followed. Yet alongside those memories was something newer, the sight of people gathering, telling their stories, standing up not just for him, but for one another. The shift had not been immediate, nor was it complete, but it had started. As he crested a low hill, he noticed a patrol car parked by the shoulder with its lights flashing, faint, steady, non-threatening. A silver sedan had been pulled over, and an older man, perhaps in his 70s, stood beside the driver's door. The officer, young and visibly composed, leaned slightly forward as he listened. Samuel slowed his vehicle as he approached, not out of concern but curiosity. From his vantage point, the exchange appeared calm. The officer gestured politely, pointed toward the dashboard, and waited as the elderly driver retrieved something from the glove compartment. The officer gave a short nod, said something that made the man chuckle softly, then returned the documents and stepped back. Within seconds, the sedan merged back into traffic without urgency, and the officer gave a small wave before returning to his cruiser. Samuel watched all of it unfold in his rearview mirror, a quiet moment that might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But for him, it carried weight. It was not a grand gesture or a sweeping policy change. It was one interaction done correctly, one citizen treated with dignity. And that was the core of everything he had worked for. Not revenge, not vindication, but the simple act of human decency made consistent. He continued down the highway, his thoughts drifting to the life he had lived before the stop and the life he had led since. He had not demanded financial compensation, nor had he sought the spotlight. He had turned down interviews, politely declined speaking engagements. His goal had never been to become a symbol. He had simply wanted to make the system work better for those who didn't have titles, power, or a voice. His tools had been process and persistence. The reward, if there was one, was in the small, almost imperceptible shifts that built over time. The sun dropped below the mountains as he neared the city limits. He rolled up his window, turned on the radio, and let the music fill the cabin. The journey had been long, the cost personal, but the road no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to everyone again. That, he thought, was enough.